Picture this: Sicily. Summer of 1943. The Mediterranean sun is absolutely brutal, the kind of heat that makes the air itself shimmer and warp, all converging on one objective: cracking open what Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. The largest seaborne invasion in history, to that point, is unfolding. And somewhere in that massive wave of steel and flesh, there's a unit that looks a little different from the rest. On their shoulder, they wear a patch, a golden Thunderbird blazing on a deep red square. They are the 45th Infantry Division. To anyone who didn't know better, they looked like just another group of National Guard soldiers from the American Southwest. But General George Patton knew better. And very soon, the entire German High Command was going to learn better the hard way. Here's what makes this story so extraordinary and so important for us to understand today. In 1940, when the 45th Division was federalized, roughly 2,000 of its 9,500 soldiers were Native American men from over 50 different tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Kiowa, Apache, and dozens more. Their parents had been forced through the horrors of Indian boarding schools, government-run institutions specifically designed to strip them of their language, their culture, and their identity. These were men who had grown up in a country that routinely denied them basic rights. In many states, they couldn't vote. The policy had a slogan that historians still quote with discomfort: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Think about that for a second. These men were crossing an ocean to fight and die for a democracy that had never fully extended its protections to them. That's not just a historical footnote. That's one of the most profound ethical paradoxes of the entire Second World Wars. And understanding it is the only way to truly understand what the Thunderbirds accomplished. Now, the Germans had enormous professional respect for Patton. They called him the closest thing America had to their own panzer generals: aggressive, lightning fast, and dangerously unpredictable. But when the 45th Division hit the beaches and began pushing through Sicily, Italy, and eventually into the heart of Europe, something started happening that German field commanders genuinely could not explain. The reports they were sending back to headquarters didn't read like military intelligence briefs. They read like ghost stories. The Thunderbirds didn't fight like other American units. They moved with an eerie, unnerving silence. They appeared exactly where they were least expected. They advanced when they should have retreated, because it tells you everything about who these men were. Not the Nazi swastika, an ancient Native American symbol that appeared across dozens of indigenous cultures for thousands of years, representing good fortune and well-being, and no matter what the Germans threw at them, they did not break. Before the war, the division's shoulder patch had actually featured a swastika. When the Nazis corrupted and weaponized that sacred image, the 45th held an internal competition in 1939 to design a new insignia. The winner was a Kiowa artist named Woody Big Bow, his design, the Thunderbird. In many indigenous traditions, the Thunderbird is a powerful, supernatural being. Its wings create thunder. Its eyes produce lightning. It is a protector, a force of nature, a guardian against evil. The symbolism of that choice would prove to be almost prophetic. Now let's talk about the actual campaign, because this is where the educational piece gets really fascinating. The Allied plan for Sicily was methodical: grind through the island, test the Germans, prepare for the real push into France. But the 45th didn't grind. They moved at a pace that completely disoriented their enemy. Here's why. And this is something military historians find genuinely remarkable. Many of the Native American soldiers in the 45th had grown up developing a deeply practical, generational relationship with land and terrain. Reading a landscape wasn't abstract for them. It was survival knowledge passed down through communities that depended on it. A broken branch told you which direction someone moved and roughly how long ago. A shift in vegetation told you where the ground softened, where water was hidden underground, where you could travel without being seen or heard. When these soldiers looked at the sun-bleached hills of Sicily, they didn't see obstacles. They saw a map that most European-trained military commanders simply couldn't read at the same level. They moved through that terrain like water, finding the path of least resistance. The result: In just 22 days, the 45th pushed through over 1,000 square miles of enemy-held territory. Entire German units found themselves surrounded before they even realized the Americans had outflanked them. Reportedly asked his interrogators with genuine bewilderment, "Don't you ever sleep?" Major General Eberhard Roth wrote in his post-war report, with barely concealed frustration, that the enemy had conducted movements through terrain that his forces had considered impassable. This is an important moment to pause on, because there's a real lesson buried here about assumptions. The Germans had spent months fortifying Sicily based on their own understanding of terrain and tactics, a framework built entirely on European military doctrine. What they hadn't accounted for was that some of the most effective knowledge in the world doesn't come from military academies. It comes from lived experience, from culture, from a relationship with the natural world that no textbook can replicate. The Thunderbirds had something the Germans had never war-gamed against. Then the campaign moved into Italy, and the story gets personal. The hills near a small Italian village called Oliveto. September 1943. It's a cold, damp morning. The air smells of wet wool and sulfur from mortar shells that have been falling throughout the night. A second lieutenant named Ernest Childers, a proud member of the Muscogee Creek Nation from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, is facing a nightmare scenario. His battalion is completely pinned down by devastating machine gun fire from German positions dug into a hilltop kit. The MG-42, what American soldiers had nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw, is firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. Men are dying in the open. And then a German mortar shell lands close enough to shatter the bones in Childers' foot. The pain is immediate and total. But Ernest Childers had grown up as one of 8 brothers who learned to shoot with 1 bullet a day, not for sport, but because during the Depression, that single bullet often meant the difference between the family eating or not. For most people, that's where the story ends. You're done. You find cover and you wait for a medic. Every shot counted because dinner depended on it. He organized 8 men and began crawling on his hands and knees. Broken foot, dragging behind him through jagged rocks and freezing mud. Working his way up that hill, Childers didn't stop. He encountered 2 German snipers sheltered in a stone house. He killed them both with precise rifle fire. He moved to the first machine gun nest and cleared it. At the second nest, in a moment of almost surreal battlefield improvisation, he picked up rocks from the ground and threw them at the German position. He then crawled farther up the hill and single-handedly captured the German mortar observer who had been directing the artillery that was killing his brothers. When the 2 soldiers raised their heads to see what was happening, he shot one. His men took the other. Ernest Childers became the first Native American in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. And when that news traveled through both armies, the reaction was telling. For the American command, it was a story of exceptional individual heroism. For the German command, it was something more disturbing. It was evidence that they were facing soldiers who simply did not respond to pain or fear the way their military doctrine predicted. That these soldiers advanced when being suppressed by fire, the exact opposite of what their training manuals described as the expected human response. They were beginning to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had built their entire military philosophy on the idea of breaking the enemy's will. And the Thunderbirds didn't seem to have a will that could be broken in any conventional way. By January 1944, the 45th Division had already done things that would have defined the entire career of most military units. Sicily. Salerno. The grinding push through the Italian countryside. But the Allied High Command wasn't done with them. They were about to be handed one of the most strategically ambitious and ultimately most brutal assignments of the entire European war. Land a force behind the German Gustav Line. Bypass the heavily fortified defensive network that had been bleeding the Allies for months, and threaten Rome directly. The operation was called Anzio. The concept was bold, almost elegant on paper. Force the Germans to pull troops from the line, crack it open, and accelerate the entire Italian campaign. Instead of driving inland aggressively, the beachhead consolidated, and the Germans responded with stunning speed, rushing reinforcements from across Italy and surrounding the Allied pocket with artillery positioned in the hills above. What actually happened was something else entirely. The landing itself went smoothly, but then the Allied advance stalled. The 45th Infantry Division was now trapped in a strip of land roughly 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep, completely surrounded on 3 sides, with the sea at their backs. What was supposed to be a strategic breakthrough became a claustrophobic, suffocating siege for 76 consecutive days. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 76 days of living in holes in the ground. The February rain turned everything into freezing mud. The cold was relentless and bone deep. Men couldn't stand during daylight hours without risking a sniper's bullet or an artillery shell. The air had that particular mixture of smells that anyone who has studied this period describes with a kind of haunted precision salt. Sickening smell of bodies in no man's land that couldn't be recovered. They slept in water. They ate cold rations because lighting a fire would immediately draw German guns. Trench foot, frostbite, psychological exhaustion that went deeper than anything the human nervous system is designed to handle. And through every single day of it, the Thunderbirds held their section of the line. This is where they earned the nickname that would define them in the history books, the Rock of Anzio. Now here's the ethical and historical dimension of this that I want you to think about, because it matters enormously. Men who had just watched their friends die at Oliveto and Salerno still could not vote in their home states, but several states had immediately found legal workarounds to disenfranchise them anyway. These men were literally fighting and dying for a democratic system that was simultaneously working to exclude them from participating in it. They held because of something the Nazi military philosophy was categorically incapable of understanding, a sense of obligation that ran deeper than politics, deeper than gratitude, deeper than any transactional relationship with the state. Because of ancestral warrior traditions that framed courage not as something you perform for an authority above you, but as something you owe to the people beside you. And yet, they held hate. They didn't hold because the government had earned their loyalty. They held because of community. That is not a small distinction. Hitler personally ordered Operation Fischfang Fish catch a massive counteroffensive designed to drive the Allies back into the sea once and for all. That is, arguably, the entire story. The German forces threw everything they had at the center of the Allied line, that soldiers described losing the ability to perceive individual explosions. The section held by the Thunderbirds. Their entire world collapsed into one continuous, unbroken roar. Stepped forward and did something that still reads today, like it belongs in mythology rather than military history. Montgomery looked out from his position near Padiglione and saw 3 separate formations of German infantry, supported by heavy machine guns, massing to overrun his platoon, and began working his way toward the first German position with a precision and patience that defied the noise and chaos surrounding him. The ground itself shook like something alive and frightened. It was into this nightmare that First Lieutenant Jack C. He told his men to cover him, called in artillery on a building where a larger German force had concentrated. And as they fled the bombardment, he captured them too. Jack Montgomery had single-handedly killed 11 German soldiers and captured 32, completely dismantling a coordinated assault that was supposed to break the Allied line. He got within grenade range before anyone detected him. His first throw was perfect. 8 Germans were killed. 4 surrendered. The German officers captured that day reportedly expressed something beyond frustration to their interrogators. They asked, with what sounds like genuine philosophical confusion, "Who are these men with the Thunderbird patches? They fight like demons and move like shadows." And this is where the story becomes not just military history, but a case study in the collapse of ideology under the weight of reality. And the Nazi racial framework, the entire theoretical foundation of the Wehrmacht's sense of superiority, was built on the belief that non-Aryan soldiers were inherently inferior warriors. That belief wasn't just propaganda for public consumption. It had actually shaped German military planning and tactical expectations. They genuinely expected certain categories of soldiers to break under pressure, to retreat when confronted with superior force. What they were encountering at Anzio was something their doctrine had no category for. Men who considered retreat a deeper wound than any bullet could inflict. The rock held. Rome fell. And then, before the dust had settled, the 45th was asked to do it all over again. Operation Dragoon, August 1944, the invasion of southern France. Their fourth amphibious assault of the war. Think about what that means logistically and psychologically. These were men who had survived the heat of Sicily, the mud of Salerno, the underground hell of Anzio. They had watched friends die on 4 separate beachheads. They were ragged, depleted, carrying losses that could never fully be replaced. The Thunderbirds had developed a tactical sophistication that blended their formal military training with something genuinely unique to their unit. In the dense forests and steep valleys of the Vosges Mountains, they used terrain the way a chess player uses the board not as a fixed constraint, but as an active weapon. And when they hit the beaches of the French Riviera, they didn't slow down. They exploded inland. Their natural scouting instincts allowed them to locate German artillery positions before those guns could open up. Their ability to move silently through wooded terrain at night became, in itself, a form of psychological warfare. German sentries reportedly began experiencing a specific, focused anxiety about the Thunderbird patrols. Because here's what was happening. Native American soldiers would slip out of their positions after dark and move through no man's land, with such precision and control that they could penetrate German lines without being detected. They would take a pistol from a sleeping officer's holster, cut telephone lines, mark positions for dawn artillery strikes. The Germans would wake up and realize that someone had been among them in the night, had moved through their defenses like a ghost, and had left before anyone knew they were there. Leave evidence that they had been there not for tactical advantage, but to plant a seed of dread. That is psychological warfare at its most intimate and effective level. Wehrmacht commanders in internal memos began referring to the 45th as Patton's personal guard of devils. They issued tactical warnings, actual written advisories telling their units, do not engage Thunderbird scouts in close quarters combat. And they had reached a conclusion that their own racial ideology should have made impossible for them to accept. These men were better at this than they were. They had run the numbers. They had seen the outcomes. Now pause here and consider what that means from a broader ethical perspective, because this is something worth sitting with. Doctrinally sophisticated ground force in the world at that point in history was being routinely outmaneuvered and psychologically dominated by men who, back in the United States, couldn't always eat in the same restaurants as their white fellow soldiers. Men whose children were still being taken from their families and placed in boarding schools. Men who were defending a democracy that was still actively debating whether they deserved to be full members of it. There's a concept in moral philosophy about the distinction between what a person owes a society and what a society owes a person. The Thunderbirds gave everything. And for a long time, the society they were protecting gave them remarkably little in return. Yet they kept going. 511 days of continuous frontline combat, more than almost any other American division in the entire European theater. Their faces carried what soldiers of that era called the 1,000-yard stare, that hollowed-out expression that comes when human beings have been pushed past the boundary of what the mind was designed to process. The men who had waded ashore in Sicily were mostly gone, replaced by reinforcements who had to absorb the Thunderbird way of fighting fast, or pay the price. Their uniforms were worn through, but the spirit remained unbroken. And German commanders, reading their own intelligence reports, were genuinely struggling to explain why. A sense of purpose, rooted not in ideology or orders from above, but in the deepest kind of human obligation to each other, to their ancestors, to the communities that had shaped them, was simultaneously a blow against the ideology of racial hierarchy, the same ideology that had shaped American policy toward native peoples for generations. The answer, of course, was invisible to the Nazi mind. These men were fueled by something that no amount of artillery could touch: a moral clarity. They weren't just fighting a war. They were, in a very real and personal sense, fighting an idea. and they were winning. March 1945. The 45th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine River and entered Germany itself. They had clawed through Italy meter by meter, survived the siege at Anzio, stormed the coast of France, and fought through the mountains and forests of Central Europe. For these men, that moment carried a weight that went beyond military strategy. They had started on the beaches of Sicily nearly 2 years earlier. German commanders in this final phase of the war described the 45th in terms that had long since moved past military analysis and into something closer to mythology. Now they were walking into the homeland of the ideology they had been sent to destroy. Patton's personal guard of devils. Men who advanced when they should retreat. Men who appeared where they were impossible to be. Men who fought as though the outcome of history itself depended on what they did in the next 5 minutes, because, in fact, it did. The Thunderbirds received orders to push toward a town in Bavaria called Dachau. To the soldiers, it was just another coordinate. A name on a map among hundreds of names on hundreds of maps they had navigated over 511 days of combat. They had no way of knowing that this particular coordinate would follow them for the rest of their lives. On April 29th, 1945, the 45th Infantry Division reached the gates of Dachau concentration camp, and the war, in every sense that truly mattered, changed forever. The first thing that reached them wasn't gunfire. It wasn't a defensive perimeter or a retreating column of German soldiers. It was a smell, a thick, heavy, sweet rotting stench that hung in the air like something physical, like something with weight and texture. The smell of death concentrated to an industrial scale. As they moved closer, they found railway tracks. Dozens of coal cars, the kind of ordinary freight cars you might see transporting timber or grain filled instead with human remains, reduced to what the soldiers described as skeletons covered in parchment. This moment carried a resonance that was different in kind from what their fellow soldiers experienced, though every man who walked through those gates that morning was permanently marked by what he saw. The indigenous soldiers carried with them the ancestral memory of their own people's systematic destruction, government policies designed not merely to defeat a people militarily, but to unmake them, to erase their culture, their language, their identity, their future. Forced marches, deliberate starvation. They had not come to Dachau without context. They recognized the architecture of organized human destruction because their own communities carried its scars. And what they found inside those gates was that same impulse, the impulse to dehumanize, to categorize, to systematically eliminate taken to its absolute, logical, industrial conclusion. And among all of this, more than 30,000 human beings still alive, barely hollow-eyed, their bodies consumed to near nothing, reaching out toward the soldiers with hands that looked like twigs. The gas chambers, the crematoriums, their ovens still warm. Rooms where bodies were stacked from floor to ceiling, reaching toward the Thunderbird patches on their shoulders as though touching a symbol of something they had stopped believing existed. Hope. These were some of the toughest, most battle-hardened soldiers in the United States Army. Men who had fought in hand-to-hand combat without flinching. Men who had watched their closest friends die and kept moving because the mission demanded it. Many of them fell to their knees and wept. Now, there is a historically contested dimension to what happened in the immediate hours after the liberation of Dachau, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. Overwhelming emotional collision of 511 days of combat with the absolute worst thing human beings have ever engineered. Some SS guards were killed. Not out of weakness, out of the only appropriate human response to what they were witnessing. By liberated prisoners. And according to some historical accounts, by American soldiers as well, this has been debated by historians for decades. Courts-martial were considered and ultimately not pursued. What is not debated is the context. These were men who had spent nearly a year and a half watching their brothers die, who had just walked through railway cars full of starved corpses, who were standing inside the physical infrastructure of industrialized mass murder. The moral and psychological weight of that moment is genuinely difficult for anyone who wasn't there to fully assess. What I think we can say, what history seems to demand that we say, is this. The soldiers of the 45th were human beings pushed to the absolute outer boundary of what human beings can be asked to process. And the question of how we judge human behavior at that outer boundary is one that moral philosophy has grappled with seriously and without easy resolution. What is beyond dispute is what the Thunderbirds understood in that moment, with a clarity that cut through every layer of exhaustion and grief. Every mile they had marched, every drop of blood they had spilled, every night in a frozen hole at Anzio, every beach they had stormed under fire, every friend they had carried and buried, all of it had been in service of this, closing the gates of something that never should have been allowed to exist. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the accounting of what the 45th Infantry Division had accomplished was staggering. 4 major amphibious assaults, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France, a record unmatched by virtually any other American division, 3 of the first 5 indigenous recipients of the Medal of Honor in the 20th century. Ernest Childers of the Muscogee Creek Nation, from communities that the United States government had spent generations attempting to assimilate, marginalize, and in some cases destroy. 511 days on the front lines. The liberation of Dachau, Jack C. Montgomery of the Cherokee Nation, Van T. Barfoot of the Choctaw Nation. 3 men. And this is the part of the story that history has a tendency to rush past, because it's uncomfortable, and because it complicates the clean, triumphalist narrative that wars are supposed to produce. Let that historical irony settle for a moment. And then the men came home. Ernest Childers returned to Oklahoma with the Medal of Honor around his neck, and found that he still couldn't vote in certain counties. Jack Montgomery went back to a state where he could be legally refused service at a restaurant because of his race. Barfoot, the man who had single-handedly disabled a Tiger tank, then carried 2 wounded comrades nearly a mile to safety, returned to Mississippi, where Jim Crow laws were fully intact and showed no signs of yielding. Van T. These men had been called by General George S. Patton himself, one of the best, if not the best, division in the history of American arms. They had been feared by the most technically advanced military force on Earth. They had liberated thousands of human beings from a death camp. And they came home to a country that was still working through whether it considered them full citizens. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It shouldn't be. Because the discomfort is the point. The discomfort is where the real historical and ethical lesson lives. And here's what makes the Thunderbirds' story ultimately transcendent rather than simply tragic. They didn't come home bitter. They came home with what their descendants and historians describe as a quiet, unshakable dignity, and have made their peace with the gap between what they gave and what they received. Not the brittle dignity of people pretending the injustice doesn't exist. They understood something that the Nazi military mind, for all its technical sophistication, never grasped and never could. That a person can fight for an ideal that their own society hasn't yet lived up to. That you can defend the promise of a thing, not just its current broken reality. That the act of fighting for freedom, even a freedom you haven't fully been granted, is itself a form of claiming it. The German generals were right to be afraid of the Thunderbirds, though perhaps not for the reasons they initially identified. Their captured officers' confessions was something they had no doctrine to counter. They had been afraid of Patton's tactical genius. They had been afraid of American industrial production. They were fighting men who possessed a spiritual and moral resilience that artillery cannot touch. Men who carried inside them a warrior tradition that had nothing to do with European military theory and everything to do with a deep, communal, ancestral understanding of what it means to protect the people who depend on you. Men for whom retreat was a more painful option than death. These soldiers proved something that history keeps having to relearn because it keeps being forgotten. Courage does not belong to one race. It does not belong to one nation, one creed, one ideology. It belongs to those who are willing to stand up when the world has given them every reason to sit down. The Thunderbirds, the Apache soldiers, the Cherokee warriors, the Muscogee men, the Choctaw fighters, and every soldier of every background who wore that golden bird into combat taught us that being treated as an outsider in your own land does not disqualify you from being its greatest protector. It may, in fact, make you its most committed one, because you know exactly what's at stake. You've seen what happens when the protections of a just society are withheld from people the powerful decide don't deserve them. The Thunderbird, that sacred symbol chosen to replace a symbol that hatred had stolen, became something more than a military insignia. It became a global emblem of what human beings are capable of when they fight for something real, not for an abstraction. Not for a government that has fully earned their loyalty, but for each other. As we look back at the photographs of those worn, weathered men, their faces carrying the dust of Italy and the weight of Dachau, their eyes holding something that no camera can fully capture, we are seeing a reflection of something essential about human nature at its best. The hidden truths of the Second World War are often found not in the grand strategic decisions of generals and heads of state, but in the stories of those who had the most to lose and the least to gain and gave everything anyway, for justice, for the living and the dead and the not yet born. We owe it to Ernest Childers and Jack Montgomery and Van Barfoot. We owe it to the thousands of Thunderbird's Native American soldiers and their brothers in arms from every background to remember their names, and to never forget the lesson they paid for in blood and sacrifice. That the most powerful weapon in any war is not a tank or an artillery, peace or a tactical doctrine. The lightning they struck still illuminates the darkest corners of what humanity is capable of, both in its evil and in its extraordinary capacity to stand against it. To honor the golden bird. It is the human spirit when it is fueled by justice. The thunder they created still echoes across the decades. That it belongs to those who hold the line when the storm arrives, who advance when everyone else is pulling back, who become the unmovable thing the world needs when everything else is crumbling. And the Thunderbird still soars, reminding us that true courage has no boundaries of race or religion or nation. And that is why, even today, the story of the 45th Infantry Division is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a living argument, made in sacrifice and blood and quiet dignity, for the kind of world worth fighting for.